President Trump has repeatedly floated the idea of completely eliminating the individual income tax. And he's continued to talk about it even after his inauguration, which means it wasn't just something he was saying in order to get elected. It might be an idea he will actually try to get pushed through. But in order to understand whether this is actually possible, we have to look at a few things, starting with the numbers. For 2024, the federal government took $4.89 trillion in taxes. However, during the same time period, they spent $6.9 trillion. The difference between what the US government takes in taxes and what it spends is called the deficit, and it is borrowed. It would be the same thing as if you earned $100,000 in a year and you spent $150,000. Typically, the only way somebody's going to be able to do that is if they borrowed the $50,000. Now, obviously, you may have saved up that $50,000 from prior years, but with the US government, and we can see that outside of this little brief period where the US government ran a surplus, in other words, they took more in taxes than they spent, every other year the US government runs a deficit, and it's been getting worse and worse. So the US government doesn't have a pile of savings that it draws on in order to cover the difference between what it takes and what it spends. Instead, it borrows. Now, considering that the amount the US government spends every year is basically at $7 trillion now, we are in a bit of a different situation today than we used to be when there was no income tax. Many people may not be aware, but up until 1913, for the US's entire history, there was no individual income tax. There was a brief period during the Civil War in which Abraham Lincoln did impose an income tax in order to pay for the war, but it was ruled unconstitutional, which is why it didn't continue past the Civil War. But in 1913, they were finally able to get an individual income tax pushed through, and the way they got it pushed through was by saying, hey, it's only for the rich. It's only gonna be 1% of income, and it's only going to be for the top 1% of income earners. All you have to do is fast forward a few decades from there and all the way to today. You see how these policies always end up backfiring on the people they were supposed to help in the first place. Today, the average person spends about half of their income on various taxes. And so the elimination of the income tax seems to a lot of people like it would result in a massive explosion of wealth, at least for them personally. But it might not even be possible considering the fact that the federal government during 2024 took almost $2.5 trillion from individuals in income taxes. So that's basically half of all of the money the US government took in the form of taxes came from individual income taxes. Now, you might still think, that's great, we could figure it out, it would still be better if they didn't take any taxes from me. Not so fast, because the individual income tax is not the only tax that is taken out of your paycheck. If you look back at this chart, you can see that in 2024, $1.7 trillion was taken through the Social Security and Medicare taxes, and that accounted for 35% of the US government's tax revenue. So if you put just those two together, which are the two biggest taxes that are taken out of most people's paychecks, unless you live in New York or California and you're also looking at a large state income tax, you're looking at about 84% of all of the tax revenue that the US government gets, they take from individuals from their paychecks. Things like corporate income taxes are only 11%, excise taxes less than 2%. And so in order to eliminate income taxes, whether or not you're focusing on the actual federal income tax or also lumping in Social Security and Medicare taxes, means that you are eliminating 50 to 85% of the federal government's entire tax revenue. Remember, in 2024, that number was about $5 trillion, which means cutting these taxes would leave the government with taking $2.5 trillion, or maybe even as low as only $1 trillion total in taxes. Considering the fact they're spending at a rate of $7 trillion a year, this means you would need not just the measly little spending cuts that the Department of Governmental Efficiency has started so far, you would need literally multiple trillions of dollars cut from federal spending year one, just to make sure the deficit doesn't blow up. That's just to keep the deficit the same. Again, a deficit of $2 trillion, just to keep that the same. In other words, this spending of $7 trillion would have to probably dip below $3 trillion, which we have not seen since before the Great Financial Crisis. Now, this isn't impossible, and it would certainly be one of the biggest explosions of wealth this country has ever seen if this were able to be pulled off. But it is a monumental task that I'm not very confident will actually be pulled off. And if you are doubtful that this would actually be good for you, just look at your paycheck. You've got a family of 4, you earn 100 grand a year, but you take home, let's say 50 or 60 of that. How much better would your life be if you were taking home 80, 90, or even all 100 of that? Imagine the savings you could stockpile, the things you could invest in, the increase in the quality of life from being able to have a healthier lifestyle, maybe get a gym membership, afford healthier food. The increase in spending and the increase in savings and investment alone would have a massive wealth effect because it's not just you, it's everybody participating in the exact same boom from the increase in spending they now have available to them. It is worth noting that if that extra spending were to happen as a result of people just having more of their own money left available to them, the other forms of tax revenue would probably go up for the US government, especially if this were paired with a complete rewrite of the Internal Revenue Code so that there were very few deductions and credits available to businesses. Pair that with a much lowered corporate income tax rate, let's say 15%, without any of the loopholes. Then you wind up with a system where all of that increased spending goes to the areas that are most productive in the economy, and the corporate income tax rises to maybe even compensate somewhat for the loss in tax revenue from giving up the individual income tax. It's also worth noting at this point that every single time in the US government's history when the Supreme Court has defined the word income, it has been defined as business profits, which means there is legal argument to say that the individual income tax is not even constitutional, even though the 16th Amendment was passed, because income by the Supreme Court has been defined as business profits. But that's a point for another video. The real question here is if the deficit were to stay the same or grow as a result of spending cuts not keeping pace with tax cuts, how would the government make up that shortfall in revenue? We know right now the deficit year to date is sitting around $710 billion, and that is done through borrowing. Now, borrowing, the source of that purchasing power, comes from 2 different places actually. We have direct purchasing power transfer with borrowing, and we have indirect purchasing power transfer. Let me explain. When the US government borrows money, they're typically going to be borrowing that money from foreign nations or from banks, and some of it from individuals. Now, if they borrow that money from regular corporations or individuals, that is a direct transfer of purchasing power. If I buy a treasury during an auction, I am voluntarily transferring my purchasing power to the US government in exchange for hopefully a little bit more purchasing power that I'll get back in the end when I get my principal and interest returned to me. However, if this borrowing is done by borrowing from banks, you have an increase in the money supply because banks, the way that the banking system operates with the fiat dollar system, is banks lend money into existence. Anytime a bank makes a loan, those are dollars that did not exist before. And so in a very real way, when you see the US government running deficits of $1 or $2 trillion every year, much of that borrowing is being borrowed into existence, meaning that's new money hitting circulation, meaning inflation. So now I think that you might see where I'm going with this. Let's say Trump is successful and eliminates the federal individual income tax. Let's say he even goes farther than that, eliminates the Social Security and Medicare taxes. Let's say he is successful at cutting a bunch of government spending. He could cut $3-4 trillion in government spending. Still, there's gonna be a $2 trillion deficit. That deficit would be covered through borrowing. When the government borrows all of that money, that is new money being lent into existence. And as the government spends that money into the economy, it drives up the prices of goods and services, which means the individual that just got a raise from being able to keep more and more of their own money and not have to pay so much in taxes, they're also going to be losing on the other side because the stuff they're buying is now going to be more expensive. So would you rather have the government take purchasing power from you by taking dollars away from you, or by making those dollars that you already have just worth less. Either way, the government is going to have to take purchasing power from you because the debt pile is $36 trillion large, and they spend $1 to $2 trillion every year on the interest on that national debt alone. We are in a phase of inflationary deleveraging, regardless of the path forward. Doesn't matter whether they take that from you from taxes or take it through inflation. That purchasing power is getting transferred from individuals to the government either way. That being said, I do need to mention that there is actually a net advantage to the government using inflation to finance its spending rather than taking that money through taxes, or at least so much of it. If the income tax were to be simplified, reduced, and or removed, you would have a few net benefits on society. Number one, a lot less money wasted on needless IRS agents. Number two, a lot less money in society wasted on CPAs and tax people who are there to support a needlessly complex system. Number three, a boost to the economy from every single CPA and tax person who was working to support a needlessly complex system of net draining wealth away from individuals, instead focusing all that work and all that brain power and all that time on doing something productive in the economy. Number four, individuals and companies alike would be able to spend a lot less time and money wasted on finding ways to save money on taxes. By and large, it would allow more individuals and companies to spend more time focusing on just the creation of wealth and not having to figure out the loopholes and the intricacies of the needlessly complicated tax system. But at the end of the day, all of this does have to go through Congress. And on the plus side, it looks like spending might be turning around a little bit and maybe is starting to head in the right direction. In other words, down. Because remember, every dollar the government spends is a dollar taken out of your pocket, either directly or indirectly. Because the government does not produce its own revenue, it does not have any surplus, it does not make any wealth. The only time the government can spend a dollar is if it takes it from somebody else first, which means definitionally speaking, taxation is extortion, at least in the United States. Hear me out. If I walk up to you and I tell you, hey, starting from now on, you must pay for my services. I'm gonna offer you some services. You have to buy them from me. You have no choice. I don't even care if you use my services, you're gonna pay for them. Part of that service is my protection. I'm gonna protect you. Oh, and by the way, if you don't pay me, I will use my men with guns, with violence, to imprison you until you decide to pay. And guess what? You can't opt out of this system even if you decide not to use my services. You can't even leave the country and not pay for my services. And yes, the United States, outside of one other dictatorship, is the only country on earth that does this. Any other country you live in, the tax systems are voluntary. If you leave, not expatriate, you just leave, you are not participating in the system anymore. Therefore, you don't have to pay for it. They're voluntary, which means by staying, you are de facto agreeing to participate in that social contract because you are choosing to stay. But in the United States, it's different. There is no choice. Therefore, it is extortion, which means that at the end of the day, if the government does shift more towards financing its expenses through borrowing and printing more than taxes, yes, there are still tons of downsides, but at least you have the choice to hold something other than dollars, which means you can somewhat protect yourself against the negative effects of that inflationary financing. You can buy gold, you can buy Bitcoin, you can buy real estate, you can buy stocks, you can buy assets instead of holding on to dollars so that you protect yourself against it. But a word of caution that if you do see us heading this direction, I would recommend getting your money into those inflation protected assets as soon as possible, because in the past, when the US government has gone through inflationary deleveragings, like from 1940 through 1980, for time periods, it was illegal and impossible to hold assets that would protect you against that inflation. Most people don't remember, prior to the 70s, it was illegal for US citizens to own gold. This is called financial repression, so the US government can unload its debt burden onto the economy without individuals having the ability to escape. Just as the tax system is involuntary today, the inflationary financing system, potentially in the future, could also be made involuntary by forcing you to hold dollars and not protect your wealth by holding other assets. So it's better to own them ahead of time so you already have them when you need them, because if push comes to shove, you might not be able to get them by that time. Now, if you'd like me to help you apply ideas like this to your investing so that you can grow your wealth more and protect it during times of crisis, I highly encourage you, check out the link in the description below. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.